This video is sponsored by World of Warships. Before we get started, I want to mention that only about 1/3 of my audience is subscribed to the channel. So if you enjoy these videos about maritime and transportation history, hit the subscribe button so you never miss a video. Thank you. Originally, the White Star Line's Olympic class consisted of Olympic, Titanic, and a contractual option for a third ship. The order for the third ship being contingent on the performance of the first two ships, as well as White Star's needs and financial position. But before the second class of the ship, Titanic, was even in service, White Star had decided to move forward with the option for the third Olympic-class ship, from shipbuilder Harland and Wolff. This third ship would become Britannic, the second ship in White Star's history to bear the name. Britannic was meant to be the ultimate Olympic-class ocean liner, implementing the best features from her two older sister ships, Olympic and Titanic. In fact, after Titanic sank, Britannic's design was enhanced even further, primarily to improve safety. These changes necessitated an adjustment to Britannic's dimensions, and she wound up being 18 inches wider at the beam than Olympic and Titanic, which, in turn, required an increase in horsepower in the form of a larger turbine engine in order to achieve the same service speed. But all of that is a story for another video, because Britannic was nearing completion at a very unfortunate time. As her fitting out was underway, with engines, funnels, and interiors being installed after the launch, her ocean liner peers already in service were being requisitioned one by one for service in the ramping up First World War. Cunard Line was notified simultaneously that Mauretania and Aquitania, the ship Britannic was meant to directly compete with, were needed for service in the Royal Navy, initially as armed merchant cruisers. Britannic's older sister ship, Olympic, was requested by the Navy a few months later in May 1915 for service as a troop transport ship. With supplies and materials being diverted for the war effort, the construction of the giant civilian ocean liner Britannic was not a priority. That is, until Harland and Wolff was notified on November 15, 1915, that Britannic was needed for service as a hospital ship. Harland and Wolff estimated that they would need 4 weeks to prepare her for this service, but suddenly the flow of materials for Britannic's completion was not an issue. And this is where the story begins. In this video, we'll be talking about the role of hospital ships in World War I, specifically through the lens of the war's most famous hospital ship, Britannic. Harland and Wolff's preparation of Britannic for service actually took about 5 weeks, a little longer than initially thought. In the meantime, crew and medical staff for the ship needed to be prepared. White Star's first choice to command Britannic was Herbert James Haddock, but Haddock was already assigned to the job of converting merchant ships into dummy battleships, and the Navy did not want to remove him from that post. So instead, Charles Bartlett was selected as captain. Bartlett had served as White Star Line's marine superintendent in the past, and had commanded the company's large liner, Cedric. He was certainly qualified. In terms of medical leadership, Lieutenant Colonel Henry Stewart Anderson was appointed senior medical officer, and would be ultimately responsible for medical operations of the ship. Another important step in preparing Britannic was notifying German authorities, via neutral communications channels, that Britannic was being deployed as a hospital ship, thus improving the chances that her protected legal status would be respected. Britannic was finally ready on December 22, 1915. But instead headed out into the Mersey and dropped anchor while waiting for the arrival of 200 medical orderlies, essentially medical stewards or assistants. Once the orderlies were aboard, Britannic weighed anchor and entered the Irish Sea in less than half an hour, because a hospital ship of her size was desperately needed. It was just past midnight on December 23, 1915. When the sun rose that morning, Britannic was in a gale, and most of her crew were seasick. As such, not much work was done that day. Dr. Harold Goodman, whose diary documents Britannic's maiden voyage, was inoculated for cholera that evening. The second day was more of the same, the wind still up and very little work to be done. Dr. Harold Goodman attended a lecture at noon on the virtues of urea as antiseptic, which he found very interesting. For the most part, the crew was not aware of where Britannic was headed, not even high-ranking physicians like Harold Goodman. However, the medical staff was made aware that they would only have 6 days to treat the wounded patients once they were picked up. Since there were only so many viable ports from which it would take 6 days to return to Britain, The number of potential destinations was greatly reduced, and many speculated that the destination was Madros in Greece, or somewhere nearby in the eastern Mediterranean. Toward the end of that day, Britannic was off the coast of Cape Finisterre in northern Spain, and the general seasickness of the crew was starting to subside. On the third day, Christmas Day, Britannic's crew awoke to high winds, but this did not stop the church service from taking place in the saloon at 11 o'clock. After the service, Lieutenant Colonel Henry Anderson, senior medical officer, addressed the medical staff, speaking about embarkation and disembarkation duties. This is when Dr. Harold Goodman was assigned towards F, L, M, N, and V. At 1400 that day, Cape St. Vincent was sighted off the port side of the ship, indication that they were likely preparing to pass through the Strait of Gibraltar and enter the Mediterranean Sea. Sure enough, a few days later, on day 6 of the maiden voyage, Britannic dropped anchor at Naples, Italy. She was there primarily to take on water and coal, which was brought on via lighters alongside. While this process was underway, some of Britannic's crew went ashore with passes to explore Naples. The next day, Dr. Harold Goodman went ashore with Senior Medical Officer Anderson, among others, before the ship sailed from Naples at 1600 under the watchful eye of Mount Vesuvius. The following day, Britannic passed by Sicily and conducted an embarkation drill at 0900, and the ship was bustling until 12:30. Once things calmed down later in the day, there was a lecture in the lounge by Professor Squires, which Dr. Goodman attended. On day 9 of the maiden voyage, which was New Year's Eve, Captain Charles Bartlett and Lieutenant Colonel Anderson rounded the wards before the ship anchored at Lemnos at 1600. The hills surrounding the harbor were littered with tents and encampments. Certainly, some of the occupants would shortly find their way aboard the gigantic ship in the harbor. At 1900, 2 hospital ships pulled up alongside Britannic with no warnings to her medical staff. These ships were the Assagai and Egypt, and they quickly started to discharge their patients to Britannic's D deck. Needless to say, things were very busy in the wards as patients were coming aboard. V ward, manned by Dr. Harold Goodman, had its 94 beds filled quickly. While the patients were given a dinner of chicken broth and cocoa around 2200, the medical staff did not eat until about 2300 that night, too busy to eat. Dr. Harold Goodman did not get into bed until 2 o'clock in the morning. The next day, New Year's Day, more patients came aboard from other hospital ships, and on January 2nd, more patients were transferred from 2 other hospital ships, as well as patients from shore. One of these patients noted in his writing that he was impressed with Britannic, her size in particular, but less impressed with the food provided to him from her stores, primarily the quantity rather than the quality, which is understandable for a wounded soldier fed just cocoa and hardtack for dinner. By the next day, January 3rd, Britannic was all but fully loaded, and she departed Lemnos around 1900 that night. While Britannic was traversing the western Mediterranean, someone called out, "Man overboard!" Let's hit pause on Britannic's story for a minute, because I want to quickly talk about how you can go back to World War I yourself with the help of the sponsor of this video, World of Warships. World of Warships is a free-to-play game for PC, which allows you to take your very own warships to sea, take part in team-based battles, and develop your own strategy and tactics to defeat the enemy. The game gives you control of more than 400 historical ships and a lifelike world in which to operate them, pitting you against both enemy ships and the changing weather itself. Choose your favorite class of ship, whether it be a battleship, destroyer, aircraft carrier, cruiser, or even submarine, and join more than 44 million players in this thrilling and competitive game. New content is released monthly. Everything from cosmetic additions to your ships to entire nations. World of Warships isn't just a game, but a unique digital floating museum of breathtaking recreations of ships from both the First and Second World Wars. So join the action and download World of Warships by clicking the link in the description below, which will give you a huge starter pack. Use the code FIRE during registration to get for free 200 doubloons, the premium battleship USS Texas, 20x Restless Fire Camouflage, 1 million credits, and 7 days of a premium account. While Britannic was traversing the western Mediterranean, someone called out, "Man overboard!" This was very unfortunate for the man overboard because while an ocean liner would typically stop mid-ocean in a similar circumstance, Britannic was not operating as an ocean liner but as a hospital ship. And even though she was legally protected from attack as a hospital ship, She was still a participant in the war, and stopping would put her and her thousands of patients and crew at risk. A head count was taken aboard Britannic, but its only purpose was to confirm that there was a person missing, which indeed there was. This man, Samuel Jones of the Drake Battalion, was later assumed dead. A few days later, Britannic was out of the Mediterranean, northbound, where she passed HMHS Mauretania. The next day, Britannic was approaching southern Britain when a patient died in the morning. It was deemed that the ship was too close to shore to bury the man at sea, as would normally be the case, so he was transferred to the mortuary at the ship's poop deck. As she approached the Isle of Wight, Britannic was met by two minesweepers, which escorted her up the Solent towards Southampton, where she docked next to Aquitania. But it was not until 3 in the afternoon when patients started to disembark, bound for hospitals throughout the country. The disembarkation process was not complete until 11 that night, and Dr. Harold Goodman was not in bed until well after midnight, and was due back in the ward at 4 o'clock in the morning. Luckily, the following day was not as demanding. Britannic remained in port for the next 11 days before beginning her second voyage. The primary task for the nurses was to make up all the beds on the ship prior to their arrival in Naples. Britannic arrived in Naples on January 25, 1916, where she took on 2,500 tons of coal and 1,500 tons of water. She was meant to sail from Mudros the next day, but Captain Bartlett received a telegram requesting that he remain put in order to take on patients from the hospital ship Grantulli Castle. It took 11 days of waiting, but Grantulli Castle finally arrived alongside Britannic to transfer 438 patients, followed by 393 patients from hospital ship Formosa. Following these transfers, Britannic was still awaiting orders. Meanwhile, officers from the American cruiser USS Des Moines boarded Britannic to inspect her for arms or any other contraband, which might compromise her status as a protected hospital ship. The United States was still neutral in the war by this time. Britannic returned to Southampton soon after, but would not return to Naples for the purpose of transferring patients again. The Italians did not want to continue using Naples as a port for medical transfers for geopolitical reasons, but would continue to allow hospital ships to use the port for logistical purposes, such as taking on coal and water. Between Britannic's second and third voyages, she was anchored off Cowes for nearly a month before making way for Naples again, this time just for coal and water. Then for Augusta, where she arrived on March 28, 1916. In Augusta, she took on patients from multiple hospital ships before turning back for Southampton, where she arrived on April 4th. After this voyage, Britannic's service as a hospital ship was in question. The evacuation of Gallipoli was largely over, and Britannic's contemporaries Mauretania and Aquitania were already being returned to their owner Cunard. Britannic remained anchored off Cowes for some time before the Navy's Transport Division finally concluded that they could no longer afford to maintain Britannic and decided to release her back to the White Star Line. The government paid White Star £76,000 for the cost of returning Britannic to a civilian state. But before White Star could even put their largest ship into commercial use, they were informed in August of that same year that the Navy would once again require Britannic for the war effort. The new German offensive in the Balkans and the Allied counterattack meant that casualties were bound to rack up. Britannic's fourth voyage was under the same general leadership as her earlier voyages, and on September 24, 1916, Britannic was once again bound for Mudros via Naples. This voyage was largely uneventful, but the fifth voyage was a source of controversy and risk. In late October 1916, Britannic was in Mudros when she took on many patients from various ships. One of these patients was 24-year-old Austrian Adalbert Franz Messany. Messany claimed to have witnessed British officers retaining their sidearms during passage aboard Britannic, technically a violation which could have potentially avoided Britannic's protected status as a hospital ship. There were other allegations of more egregious violations, which served to further put into doubt the legitimacy of Britannic's claim to legal protection from attack by enemy ships and U-boats, including the possibility that Britannic was transporting armed military personnel below decks. Generally, Messany's allegations were likely fabricated, aside from perhaps some minor transgressions. Nonetheless, Britannic's safety was at serious risk, since Germany's U-boats likely could have sunk her without any serious consequences as a result of the claims made by Messany. Coincidentally, perhaps, Germany's U-boat U-73 spotted multiple hospital ships in the Kia Channel, through which Britannic passed on that same day during her 5th voyage. The U-boat even recorded in its log that it positioned itself to fire upon a large ship before realizing that it was a hospital ship and backing down. That same U-boat, shortly thereafter, laid 2 mine barriers of 6 mines each in that same channel through which Britannic had passed hours earlier. Following her controversial 5th voyage, Britannic was only in Southampton for about a week before she was forced to head out earlier than expected, due to the damage inflicted upon HMHS Aquitania during her recent return voyage. Britannic left Southampton on her unexpected voyage in the early afternoon of November 12, 1916. She passed through the Strait of Gibraltar about 2.5 days later at midnight and arrived in Naples on the morning of November 17th for her usual coal and water resupply stop. Despite just having arrived in port, that morning would likely have been a relatively happy time aboard Britannic, as breakfast time was known to be the most friendly and joyous time of day for a hospital ship. Due to the harsh weather, Captain Bartlett was forced to keep his ship in Naples until the afternoon of November 19th, when there was a small lapse in the rough weather, long enough for Britannic to put out to sea, only for the weather to come back up. It was during this leg of her voyage that Britannic would transit the Kiel Canal on her way to take on patients, the same channel in which Germany's submarine U-73 had laid a dozen mines weeks earlier. It was only through sheer misfortune that these mines were not swept and destroyed earlier, as the 13,000 gross register ton French troopship Bertigala had struck one of these mines earlier, but this was thought to be a torpedo attack due to the reports that the ship had seen a periscope before the sinking. Had this not been the case, the channel would most certainly have been swept for mines. But alas, it was not, and Britannic struck a mine in the Kiel Channel during her 6th voyage on November 21st, 1916. At once, everyone at breakfast dropped what they were doing or eating and scrambled, knowing full well what had happened, or at least that something had happened. Whatever it was, the nurses thanked their lucky stars that Britannic lacked a full complement of wounded passengers. If she had, the events that followed would have been infinitely more deadly. And since this video is about the role of hospital ships in World War I rather than Britannic herself, I will stop this video here. I may do a video on Britannic, her life, and her sinking in the future, but this video was intended to provide insight into the importance and realities of hospital ships during the First World War, through the lens of Britannic, and I hope that it served this purpose well. One of the sources of this video was the memoir of Violet Jessop. Jessop was a nurse aboard Britannic on her final voyage, but had also been a stewardess aboard both Olympic and Titanic, and as a result, she had witnessed firsthand an incredible number of historical events at sea. I plan to make a video about her fascinating life in the future, so be sure to subscribe if you haven't already. And remember to click the link in the description below to claim your huge starter pack for World of Warships.